Marcus Chun had always been the type of kid who preferred the corner table in the cafeteria, the back row in class, and the long way home that avoided the main courtyard. At 17, he'd perfected the art of invisibility at Roosevelt High School in suburban Denver, Colorado. But on that Tuesday in October, everything changed when 3 seniors decided his quiet existence was about to become very loud. What happened next in that cafeteria would become legendary at Roosevelt High, not because of the humiliation Marcus endured, but because of what he unleashed in response. This is the story of how a shy teenager's hidden skills turned a moment of cruelty into the most talked about incident in the school's history. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Marcus had been attending Roosevelt High for 3 years, and in all that time, he'd managed to fly completely under the radar. While his classmates were joining sports teams, drama clubs, and student government, Marcus spent his lunch periods reading philosophy books and his afternoons working part-time at his uncle's martial arts studio downtown. Most students didn't even know his name. They just saw the quiet Asian kid who always sat alone and never caused trouble. The invisibility suit worked perfectly until Derek Hoffman arrived at Roosevelt as a transfer student from California. Derek was everything Marcus wasn't: tall, athletic, with the kind of confidence that immediately attracted followers. Within 2 weeks, he'd assembled his own crew: Tommy Rodriguez, a stocky football player who'd been benched for poor grades, and Kyle Morrison, whose wealthy parents had bought him a lifted truck and an oversized ego to match. Derek had a particular talent for identifying weakness, and something about Marcus's quiet demeanor triggered his predatory instincts. It started small: shoulder checks in the hallway, accidental book drops, whispered comments just loud enough for Marcus to hear. Marcus absorbed it all without reaction, hoping that ignoring the behavior would make it stop. The escalation began. During third period chemistry class, Mrs. Patterson had paired students randomly for a lab experiment, and Marcus found himself working alongside Derek. While Marcus methodically measured compounds and recorded observations, Derek spent the period making increasingly personal comments about Marcus's appearance, his clothes, his lack of friends. When Marcus remained silent, Derek grew bolder. "You know what your problem is, Chun?" Derek said, deliberately knocking over Marcus's carefully organized notes. "You're like a ghost. Nobody even knows you exist here." Marcus quietly gathered his scattered papers and continued working. His uncle had taught him that true strength came from controlling your response, not controlling others. But Derek interpreted the silence as fear, and fear was exactly what he wanted to cultivate. The next day, Derek convinced Tommy and Kyle to help him have some fun with Marcus. They started following him between classes, making comments about his backpack, his shoes, the way he walked. When Marcus took his usual route through the less crowded hallways, they'd be there waiting. When he tried alternate paths, they seemed to anticipate his movements. Marcus's carefully constructed world of invisibility was crumbling. The other students were starting to notice the attention Derek was giving him, and whispers followed him wherever he went. Some kids looked at him with pity, others with the morbid curiosity of watching a slow-motion accident. But no one intervened. At Roosevelt High, the unwritten rule was simple: don't get involved in someone else's problems. The situation reached a breaking point on a Thursday afternoon in the cafeteria. Marcus had chosen his usual corner table, hoping to eat his lunch in peace while reading a book about Buddhist philosophy. The cafeteria was packed with the usual chaos of teenage social dynamics: athletes claiming the center tables, drama kids clustering near the windows, and various cliques maintaining their territorial boundaries. Derek spotted Marcus from across the room and nudged Tommy and Kyle. They'd been planning something special, and Derek had decided it was time to make their move public. He wanted an audience for what he had in mind. "Watch this," Derek announced to nearby tables as he approached Marcus's corner. "Time to wake up, Sleeping Beauty." Marcus sensed the approaching trouble before he looked up. The conversations at nearby tables had quieted, and he could feel dozens of eyes turning in his direction. When he finally raised his head, he saw Derek standing directly in front of him, holding a full tray of spaghetti and meatballs from the lunch line. "Hey Marcus," Derek said with mock friendliness. "You look hungry. Let me help you with that." Before Marcus could react, Derek tilted the tray and dumped the entire contents directly onto Marcus's head. Hot marinara sauce streamed down his face and neck, soaking into his white button-down shirt. Chunks of ground beef and pasta fell onto his book and scattered across the table. The thick, sticky mess covered his hair and dripped onto his lap. The cafeteria erupted in gasps, laughter, and the sound of phones being pulled out to record the spectacle. Marcus sat frozen, sauce burning his eyes, as Derek, Tommy, and Kyle high-fived each other and began making loud comments about how he looked like a walking spaghetti monster. "Oops," Derek said loudly enough for half the cafeteria to hear. "Looks like someone's having Italian for lunch today." Marcus slowly wiped the sauce from his eyes with his sleeve, leaving red streaks on the white fabric. He could hear the laughter growing louder, could see students pointing and recording with their phones. The humiliation was complete and public, exactly as Derek had intended. But as Marcus sat there, covered in food and surrounded by mockery, something was shifting inside him. For 3 years, he'd chosen invisibility over confrontation. He'd absorbed countless small cruelties in silence, believing that patience and non-engagement would eventually win. But Derek had crossed a line that Marcus's training wouldn't let him ignore. You see, what Derek and his friends didn't know was that Marcus had been studying Muay Thai for 6 years, under his uncle's guidance. Every day after school, while his classmates were at football practice or hanging out at the mall, Marcus was in the gym learning the art of 8 limbs. His uncle, a former professional fighter from Thailand, had taught him not just techniques, but philosophy, that martial arts were for protection, not aggression, and that true warriors choose their battles carefully. Marcus had never mentioned his training to anyone at school. It wasn't part of the quiet academic image he'd cultivated. But as he sat there, dripping with marinara sauce while Derek continued to mock him for the entertainment of their classmates, Marcus realized that some battles choose whether you want them or not. The laughter was reaching a crescendo when Marcus finally stood up. Sauce continued to drip from his hair as he calmly removed his ruined shirt, revealing a lean but surprisingly muscled torso that made several nearby students do double takes. The mockery began to fade as people noticed something different about the way Marcus was carrying himself. Gone was the hunched, apologetic posture they'd grown accustomed to seeing. Instead, Marcus stood with the balanced, centered stance of someone who knew exactly what their body could do. His breathing was controlled, his movements deliberate, and his eyes held a focus that made Derek's confident smirk begin to waver. "Problem, Chun?" Derek asked, but there was a slight uncertainty in his voice now. Something about Marcus's transformation was setting off alarm bells in his predatory instincts. Marcus didn't respond immediately. Instead, he was calculating distances, noting the positions of Derek, Tommy, and Kyle, and assessing the space around him. The cafeteria had gone eerily quiet, as if everyone sensed that something significant was about to happen. When Marcus finally spoke, his voice was calm and measured, not the frightened whisper Derek had expected, but the controlled tone of someone who had made a decision. "Actually, yes. There is a problem." The transformation in Marcus's demeanor sent ripples of unease through the watching crowd. Derek's 2 friends instinctively stepped closer, forming a loose triangle around Marcus, but their body language betrayed their uncertainty. This wasn't the cowering victim they'd expected to see. "What's that supposed to mean?" Derek demanded, trying to reclaim his dominance through volume and aggression. He stepped forward, invading Marcus's personal space with the swagger that had served him. While in previous confrontations, Marcus's response was to shift his weight slightly, dropping into a subtle fighting stance that most observers wouldn't recognize, but that immediately activated muscle memory from thousands of hours of training. His uncle's voice echoed in his mind. "Distance is your friend. Control the range. Control the fight." "It means this ends now," Marcus said, his voice carrying a quiet authority that made several nearby students lean forward in their seats. Derek misread the situation completely. In his experience, quiet kids back down when pushed hard enough. The fact that Marcus was standing up to him only meant he needed to push harder. Without warning, Derek lunged forward and shoved Marcus hard in the chest with both hands. What happened next unfolded in a series of movements, so fluid and precise that many witnesses would later struggle to describe exactly what they'd seen. Marcus absorbed the push by stepping back with perfect balance, his hands coming up in a defensive guard position. But Derek, emboldened by what he perceived as retreat, pressed his attack by throwing a wild haymaker punch aimed at Marcus's face. Punch never connected. Marcus slipped the strike with minimal movement, his head shifting just enough to let Derek's fist pass harmlessly by his ear. In the same motion, Marcus's right elbow snapped upward in a devastating arc that caught Derek squarely under the jaw. The impact made a sound like a baseball bat hitting a watermelon, and Derek's head snapped back violently. The cafeteria erupted in shocked gasps as Derek stumbled backward, his eyes rolling and his knees buckling. He managed to stay upright, but blood was already streaming from his mouth where he'd bitten his tongue. The confident smirk was gone, replaced by a look of dazed confusion. Tommy Rodriguez, seeing his leader in trouble, rushed in from Marcus's left side. Tommy outweighed Marcus by at least 40 pounds and had the bulk of a football lineman. But size meant nothing against technique. As Tommy charged forward with his arms spread wide for a tackle, Marcus pivoted on his right foot and drove his left elbow horizontally into Tommy's solar plexus. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The strike hit with surgical precision, driving all the air from Tommy's lungs and dropping him to his knees. He gasped frantically, his face turning red as he struggled to breathe. Marcus had targeted the nerve cluster perfectly, temporarily paralyzing Tommy's diaphragm without causing permanent damage. Kyle Morrison, witnessing his two friends neutralized in the span of seconds, hesitated. His wealthy upbringing hadn't prepared him for actual violence, and seeing Derek's bloodied face and Tommy's gasping form made him reconsider his commitment to the fight. But peer pressure and the watching crowd pushed him forward. Kyle approached more cautiously than his friends had, raising his fists in what he imagined was a proper fighting stance. Marcus recognized the amateur posture immediately, all aggression. No defense, leaving massive openings. When Kyle threw a telegraphed right cross, Marcus ducked under it and came up with a rising elbow that caught Kyle on the point of his chin. The impact lifted Kyle off his feet momentarily before he crashed backward into an empty table, scattering plastic trays and utensils across the floor. He lay there motionless for several seconds before rolling onto his side and groaning softly. The entire exchange had taken less than 30 seconds. 3 attackers had been neutralized with 3 precise elbow strikes, each one delivered with the kind of technical perfection that spoke to years of dedicated training. The cafeteria was dead silent, except for Tommy's labored breathing and the distant sound of Derek spitting blood into his hand. Marcus stood in the center of the chaos, his breathing still controlled and even. There was no anger in his expression, no satisfaction at having defeated his tormentors. Instead, he looked almost disappointed, as if he'd hoped the situation could have been resolved differently. "Anyone else?" Marcus asked quietly, his eyes scanning the faces of the students who had been laughing at his humiliation just minutes before. No one moved. No one spoke. The question hung in the air like a challenge that everyone was afraid to accept. Derek, still stunned from the elbow strike, managed to focus his eyes on Marcus. The taste of blood in his mouth was sharp and metallic, and his jaw felt like it might be dislocated. But more than the physical pain, it was the complete reversal of power dynamics that left him reeling. In less than a minute, he'd gone from predator to prey, and the transformation had been witnessed by half the school. You're crazy, Derek mumbled through swollen lips, backing away from Marcus while trying to salvage some dignity from the situation. This isn't over, Marcus's response was to take a single step forward, causing Derek to flinch involuntarily. The movement was slight, but it demonstrated everything about how the balance of power had shifted. Derek, who had terrorized Marcus for weeks, was now genuinely afraid of his former victim. Yes, it is, Marcus replied with quiet finality. It's completely over. The authority in his voice was undeniable. This wasn't a threat or a boast. It was simply a statement of fact. Derek seemed to understand this on some instinctive level, because he nodded slightly and began backing toward the cafeteria exit, gesturing for Tommy and Kyle to follow him. Tommy struggled to his feet, still breathing heavily, while Kyle slowly pulled himself upright, using the overturned table for support. Both boys moved gingerly, clearly shaken by the speed and precision of Marcus's counterattack. They flanked Derek as he retreated, but there was no longer any menace in their posture, only the careful movements of people who had just learned. They were not as tough as they'd believed. As the three bullies made their way toward the exit, conversations slowly began to resume throughout the cafeteria. But the topics had changed dramatically. Students were no longer discussing weekend plans or homework assignments. Instead, hushed voices were analyzing what they'd just witnessed, trying to process how the quiet kid from the corner table had just dismantled three larger opponents with such clinical efficiency. Marcus calmly picked up his ruined shirt and began gathering his scattered belongings. The marinara sauce had dried sticky on his skin, and he could feel the weight of hundreds of stares from his classmates. But the quality of attention had changed completely. Where before he'd been invisible or pitied, now he commanded a different kind of respect, one born from demonstrated capability rather than fear. Sarah Mitchell, a girl from his AP literature class, approached hesitantly. She'd never spoken to Marcus before, but like everyone else, she'd witnessed the transformation from victim to victor. "Are you okay?" she asked, offering him some napkins from her table. Marcus accepted the napkins gratefully and began wiping the sauce from his face and arms. "I'm fine," he said simply. "Thank you." "That was incredible," Sarah continued, her voice filled with genuine admiration. "I had no idea you could. I mean, where did you learn to do that?" Marcus paused in his cleaning, considering how to answer. For years, he'd kept his martial arts training secret, viewing it as a private discipline rather than a social identifier. But recent events had made secrecy impossible. "My uncle's dojo," he said finally. "I've been training since I was 11. Word of Marcus's hidden skills was already spreading through the cafeteria like wildfire. Students were pulling out their phones to text friends in other classes, and the few who had managed to record parts of the confrontation were becoming instant celebrities. By the end of the lunch period, the story would be all over social media, and by the end of the school day, it would be legend. The bell signaling the end of lunch period rang across Roosevelt High, but the usual stampede toward classrooms was replaced by clusters of students huddled together, still processing what they'd witnessed. Marcus gathered his belongings and headed toward his locker, acutely aware that his every movement was being scrutinized by his classmates. The hallway buzz was unlike anything he'd experienced before. Instead of the usual invisibility, Marcus found himself at the center of whispered conversations and not so subtle pointing. Phone screens lit up around him as students showed each other grainy videos of the confrontation, and he could hear fragments of excited commentary trailing in his wake. "Did you see how fast he moved?" one freshman whispered to another. "It was like something out of a movie." "I hear he's been training with some professional fighters," added a senior girl, her voice filled with newfound respect. Marcus reached his locker and began gathering his afternoon textbooks, trying to process this sudden shift in his social standing. For 3 years, he'd cultivated anonymity as a survival strategy. Now that carefully constructed invisibility had been shattered in 30 seconds of violence, his phone buzzed with a text from his uncle. "Picking you up after school today. We need to talk." Marcus stared at the message, realizing that news of the incident had already reached beyond the school walls. His uncle ran a traditional dojo where discipline and restraint were paramount. Using martial arts in a school fight, even in self-defense, would require explanation. The afternoon classes passed in a blur of distraction. Teachers tried to maintain normal lessons, but the undercurrent of excitement from the cafeteria incident made concentration impossible. Marcus found himself fielding whispered questions from classmates who had never acknowledged his existence before. In a P history, Jessica Torres leaned over during a documentary about World War II. "Is it true you've been training since you were a kid?" she asked quietly. "Yes," Marcus replied simply, keeping his eyes on the screen. "That's so cool," she continued. "I always wondered why you were so confident, underneath." Marcus wasn't sure how to respond to that. He'd never thought of himself as confident, quite the opposite. But perhaps years of physical training had created a presence he wasn't even aware of. During chemistry, even Mrs. Patterson seemed affected by the day's events. She kept glancing at Marcus's empty lab station where Derek would have been sitting, and her usual strict demeanor softened when she addressed him directly. "Marcus, would you mind demonstrating the proper measurement technique for the class?" she asked during the afternoon lab. As Marcus stepped forward to help, he noticed that his classmates watched him with a different kind of attention. There was no mockery or dismissal in their faces. Instead, he saw genuine interest and respect. The final bell couldn't come soon enough. Marcus made his way to the parking lot, where his uncle's distinctive black Honda Civic waited in the pickup zone. David Chun was a compact man in his 40s, with the weathered hands of someone who'd spent decades training fighters. His expression was unreadable as Marcus approached the car. "Get in," his uncle said quietly once Marcus had settled into the passenger seat. "We're going to the dojo." They drove in silence through downtown Denver, past the familiar strip malls and traffic lights that marked Marcus's daily route. His uncle's dojo occupied the second floor of a converted warehouse, accessible only by a narrow staircase that discouraged casual visitors. Inside, the space was spartanly furnished with heavy bags, Thai pads, and a boxing ring that had seen thousands of hours of training. Faded photographs of Muay Thai champions lined the walls, and the air carried the familiar scent of leather and liniment. "Sit," David said, gesturing toward the benches that lined one wall. "Tell me exactly what happened today." Marcus recounted the weeks of escalating harassment, the cafeteria incident, and his response to Derek's physical attack. His uncle listened without interruption, occasionally nodding or asking for clarification about specific details. "How did you feel when it was over?" David asked when Marcus finished his account. "Disappointed," Marcus replied honestly. "I kept hoping it wouldn't come to that." David studied his nephew's face carefully. "Good. That tells me your training hasn't been wasted. A true martial artist finds no joy in violence, even when it's necessary." "But I used what you taught me to hurt people," Marcus said, voicing the guilt that had been building throughout the afternoon. "You used what I taught you to protect yourself," David corrected. "There's a difference. Those boys chose to attack. You chose to survive." David stood and walked to a cabinet in the corner, returning with a worn leather journal. This belonged to my teacher in Bangkok. He used to say that martial arts without philosophy creates bullies, but philosophy without martial arts creates victims. Today you found the balance. Marcus opened the journal, scanning pages filled with handwritten notes in Thai script, alongside English translations. The wisdom seemed to speak directly to his current situation. What happens now? Marcus asked. Everyone at school knows about my training. They're looking at me differently. That's not necessarily a bad thing, David replied. You've spent years hiding who you are. Maybe it's time to let people see the real Marcus Chun. But what if they expect me to be some kind of fighter now? What if other people want to test themselves against me? David smiled for the first time. Since picking Marcus up, then you'll handle each situation as it comes. You have the skills to protect yourself, and more importantly, you have the judgment to know when those skills are necessary. They spent the next hour working through forms and techniques, but the session felt different than usual. Marcus moved with a confidence that hadn't been there before, as if the afternoon's events had unlocked something that had been dormant. His strikes were more precise, his footwork more fluid, his timing more natural. Your technique has improved, David observed as they finished their training. Sometimes we need to test our skills in reality before we can truly understand them. As they prepared to leave, David placed a hand on Marcus's shoulder. Tomorrow will be different at school. People will treat you differently, and you'll need to decide how to respond to that change. Remember that respect earned through fear is temporary, but respect earned through character lasts forever. On the drive home, Marcus reflected on his uncle's words. The shy, invisible student he'd been that morning was gone forever, replaced by someone who would need to navigate an entirely new social landscape. Some students would admire his skills, others might fear him, and still others would seek to challenge him. But for the first time in years, Marcus wasn't afraid of the attention. The cafeteria incident had been a catalyst, forcing him to integrate two parts of himself that he'd kept separate for too long. The quiet student and the disciplined martial artist were the same person, and both aspects deserved to exist in the light. His phone buzzed with messages from classmates he'd never spoken to before, invitations to study groups and weekend gatherings. That would have been unthinkable just hours earlier. The social isolation that had defined his high school experience was ending, replaced by opportunities he'd never imagined. As they pulled into his driveway, Marcus realized that Derek's cruelty had inadvertently given him the greatest gift possible, the courage to stop hiding who he really was. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for the first time in 3 years, he was looking forward to facing them. Marcus arrived at Roosevelt High the next morning to find his locker surrounded by a small crowd of curious students. Word of the cafeteria incident had spread far beyond those who witnessed it, growing into something approaching legend with each retelling. As he approached, conversations quieted and heads turned, but the atmosphere was completely different from the day before. Marcus, called out Jake Williams, a junior from his English class who had never spoken to him before. Is it true you've been training with a professional fighter? Before Marcus could answer, Amanda Foster, the student council president, stepped forward. We heard what Derek did to you yesterday. I'm sorry nobody stepped in to help. Marcus appreciated the apology, but he was more interested in moving past the incident than rehashing it. It's okay, sometimes these things just happen. But it shouldn't have happened, Amanda insisted. We're organizing a school-wide assembly about bullying prevention. Would you be willing to speak about your experience? The request caught Marcus off guard. Public speaking had never been part of his comfort zone, and the idea of addressing the entire student body made his stomach tighten. But something about Amanda's earnest expression and the expectant faces around him made him consider the possibility. I'll think about it, he said finally, earning approving nods from the gathered students. As the crowd dispersed, Marcus noticed Derek approaching from the opposite end of the hallway. The older boy's jaw was visibly swollen, and there was a purple bruise along his left cheekbone. But more striking than the physical damage was the change in Derek's demeanor. Gone was the predatory confidence that had defined his presence at Roosevelt High. Derek stopped a respectful distance away, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. "Can we talk?" he asked quietly. Marcus studied Derek's face, looking for signs of deception or continued aggression. What he saw instead was genuine uncertainty, perhaps even remorse. "What do you want to say?" "I wanted to apologize," Derek said, the words coming out awkwardly. "What I did yesterday was wrong. The whole thing, following you around, the comments, dumping food on you, it was messed up." Marcus waited for Derek to continue, sensing there was more behind the apology than simple regret. "I guess I thought picking on you would make me feel better about my own problems," Derek continued. "My parents are getting divorced, and I got kicked off my last school's football team for fighting. I took all that anger out on you instead of dealing with it." The admission hung in the air between them. Marcus had expected many things from Derek, but genuine vulnerability wasn't one of them. It forced him to see his former tormentor as something more complex than a simple villain. "I accept your apology," Marcus said finally. "But understanding why you did it doesn't make it okay." "I know," Derek replied. "I'm not asking for forgiveness. I just wanted you to know that I'm going to do better. I'm starting counseling sessions with Ms. Rodriguez in the guidance office." Marcus nodded, recognizing the courage it took for Derek to admit his mistakes publicly. "That's good. I hope it helps." As Derek walked away, Marcus reflected on how violence had somehow led to this moment of honesty. The confrontation had stripped away Derek's false confidence, revealing the insecure teenager underneath. In a strange way, both boys had been freed from the roles they'd been playing. The morning classes proceeded more normally than Marcus had expected. Teachers maintained their usual routines, and while students still glanced at him with curiosity, the intense scrutiny of the previous day had settled into a manageable level of attention. During lunch, Marcus found himself facing a new dilemma. His usual corner table was occupied by Jessica Torres and several other students from his advanced placement classes. They waved him over enthusiastically, clearly expecting him to join their group. "Marcus, come sit with us," Jessica called out. "We saved you a spot." Marcus hesitated, realizing that accepting the invitation would represent a fundamental change in his social status. For 3 years, he'd eaten lunch alone by choice, using the time to read or simply think. Joining a group meant engaging in conversation, sharing opinions, and allowing others to know him better. But as he looked around the cafeteria, he noticed other changes taking place. Tommy Rodriguez was sitting alone at a table near the windows, picking at his food with none of his usual boisterous energy. Kyle Morrison had joined a different group of students, keeping his head down and avoiding eye contact with anyone who might bring up yesterday's events. The social ecosystem of Roosevelt High was recalibrating itself around the new reality of Marcus's revealed capabilities. Some students approached him with genuine interest and friendship, others with the kind of respect reserved for someone who had proven themselves dangerous. A few kept their distance entirely, uncertain how to interact with someone who had so dramatically defied their expectations. Marcus made his decision and walked over to Jessica's table. The conversation that followed was unlike any he'd experienced at school before. Instead of the casual small talk he'd expected, his new companions asked thoughtful questions about his martial arts training, his philosophy studies, and his plans for college. "I've been thinking about what you said yesterday," Sarah Mitchell commented during a discussion about conflict resolution, "about how violence should be a last resort. Do you really believe that?" "I have to," Marcus replied. "If I didn't believe it, then what happened yesterday would make me no different from Derek." "But you were defending yourself," argued Michael Park, a senior who had witnessed the cafeteria incident. "That's completely different from being a bully." "The result was the same," Marcus said. 3 people got hurt. "The fact that they started it doesn't change the fact that I finished it." The conversation continued throughout the lunch period, touching on topics that Marcus had never discussed with his peers before. He discovered that his classmates were more thoughtful and complex than he'd given them credit for, just as they were learning that the quiet kid from the corner had depths they'd never suspected. As the day progressed, Marcus began to understand what his uncle had meant about character-based respect. Students weren't just impressed by his fighting skills, they were drawn to his thoughtful approach to conflict and his reluctance to celebrate violence. His reputation was being built on more than just physical capability. The final period brought an unexpected visitor to Marcus's AP literature class. Principal Henderson knocked on the door and asked to speak with him privately in the hallway. "I wanted to discuss yesterday's incident," Principal Henderson said once they were alone. "Several students have come forward with reports about the harassment you experienced leading up to the cafeteria confrontation." Marcus wasn't sure how to respond. He'd expected disciplinary action, not sympathy. "I also reviewed the security footage," the principal continued. "It clearly shows that you acted in self-defense after being physically attacked. There will be no suspension or formal punishment." "What about Derek and the others?" Marcus asked. "They've been suspended for a week and will face additional consequences when they return. But I'm more concerned about you right now. How are you handling all the attention?" Marcus considered the question carefully. "It's different than I expected, but I think I'm managing okay." "Good. I want you to know that the faculty is impressed with how you've handled this situation. Your maturity and restraint, even under extreme provocation, sets an example for other students." As Marcus returned to class, he realized that his transformation was complete. The shy, invisible student who had walked into school that morning was gone, replaced by someone who commanded respect through character rather than fear. The cafeteria incident had been a catalyst, but the real change had come from his willingness to integrate all aspects of his identity. His phone buzzed with a text from his uncle. "Proud of you. See you at training tonight." For the first time in 3 years, Marcus Chun was looking forward to tomorrow at Roosevelt High School. Not because the challenges would be easier, but because he finally knew who he was and what he stood for. The food dumping incident had lasted 30 seconds, but its impact would shape the rest of his high school experience in ways he was only beginning to understand. 3 weeks after the cafeteria incident, Marcus found himself standing in front of Roosevelt High's packed auditorium, preparing to address nearly 800 students and faculty members. The anti-bullying assembly that Amanda Foster had proposed had grown into a district-wide event, with representatives from 3 other high schools in attendance. Principal Henderson stepped up to the microphone first, his voice carrying clearly through the sound system. "Today we're here to discuss something that affects every one of us, how we treat each other in our school community. Our speaker today is someone who has shown us that real strength comes not from intimidating others, but from having the courage to stand up for what's right." As Marcus walked toward the podium, he could see familiar faces throughout the audience. Derek sat in the 3rd row, having returned from his suspension with a noticeably different attitude. Tommy and Kyle were scattered among their respective friend groups, both looking uncomfortable but attentive. Near the back, Marcus spotted his uncle David, who had taken time off work to attend the presentation. "3 weeks ago, I was the kid who ate lunch alone every day," Marcus began, his voice steady despite the butterflies in his stomach. "I thought that staying invisible would keep me safe from the kind of harassment that happens in every school. I was wrong." He went on to describe the escalation of Derek's behavior, careful not to demonize his former tormentor, but honest about the impact of sustained bullying. The harassment didn't happen all at once. It started small, a shoulder check here, a cruel comment there. Each incident by itself seemed manageable, but together they created an environment where I felt powerless. Marcus noticed several students nodding in recognition, and he realized his experience wasn't as unique as he'd believed. The day Derek dumped food on my head, I had a choice to make. I could continue to absorb the abuse and hope it would eventually stop, or I could defend myself. I chose to fight back, but that choice came with consequences I'm still learning to understand. He talked about the responsibility that came with martial arts training, emphasizing his uncle's teachings about using violence only as a last resort. Having the ability to hurt someone doesn't give you the right to do it. It gives you the responsibility to protect those who can't protect themselves. The auditorium was completely silent now, with students leaning forward in their seats. Marcus had found his rhythm, speaking with the same quiet authority that had emerged during the cafeteria confrontation. But here's what I learned that surprised me most, Marcus continued. The real victory wasn't winning the fight. It was what happened afterward, when Derek came to apologize and we both realized that we're more complex than the roles we'd been playing. From his seat in the third row, Derek shifted uncomfortably but maintained eye contact with Marcus. The two had spoken several times since that first apology, building an unlikely friendship based on mutual respect rather than fear. Derek taught me something important about bullying, Marcus said. Hurt people hurt people. When someone is cruel to you, it's usually because they're dealing with pain in their own life. That doesn't excuse their behavior, but it helps explain it. Marcus went on to discuss the broader implications of the incident, talking about how bystanders play a crucial role in either enabling or preventing bullying. Every person in that cafeteria had a choice when Derek attacked me. They could intervene, they could record it for entertainment, or they could look away and pretend it wasn't happening. The choices we make in those moments define who we are. As a community, he shared specific strategies for intervention that didn't require physical confrontation, alerting teachers, supporting victims after incidents, and creating inclusive social environments where bullying was less likely to take root. The most important thing I want you to understand is that everyone in this room has power, Marcus said, building toward his conclusion. You have the power to include someone who's sitting alone. You have the power to speak up when you see someone being mistreated. You have the power to choose kindness over cruelty, even when no one is watching. As Marcus finished his presentation and stepped away from the podium, the auditorium erupted in sustained applause. Students stood up throughout the room, many of them visibly moved by his words. Near the back, his uncle David was clapping with obvious pride. But the real impact of Marcus's speech became clear in the days that followed. Students began approaching him with their own stories of harassment and isolation, seeking advice on how to handle difficult situations. Teachers incorporated his message into their classroom discussions, and the administration implemented new policies based on his recommendations. More significantly, the social dynamics at Roosevelt High began to shift in measurable ways. The rigid clique structure that had defined the school's social hierarchy started to blur as students made conscious efforts to include outsiders. Lunch tables became more diverse, study groups crossed traditional social boundaries, and the general atmosphere of the school became noticeably more welcoming. Derek's transformation was perhaps the most dramatic example of this change. His counseling sessions with Ms. Rodriguez had helped him understand the connection between his family problems and his aggressive behavior. He'd begun volunteering with the school's peer mediation program, using his own experience to help other students work through conflicts peacefully. I spent so much energy trying to make other people feel small because I felt small myself, Derek explained during one of his training sessions. Now I'm trying to figure out how to build people up instead of tearing them down. Tommy Rodriguez had also made significant changes, joining the school's diversity club and becoming an advocate for students who struggled academically. His own experience with being humiliated had given him empathy for others, who felt powerless in various aspects of their lives. Even Kyle Morrison, whose participation in the bullying had been more passive, found ways to contribute positively to the school environment. He started a program using his family's financial resources to provide school supplies for students who couldn't afford them, turning his privilege into a tool for helping others. Marcus's role in these changes extended far beyond his single speech. He'd become an informal counselor for students dealing with bullying, a bridge between different social groups, and a living example of how individuals could transform their circumstances through courage and principle. His academic performance, which had always been strong, improved even further as he gained confidence in classroom discussions and group projects. Teachers who had barely noticed him before now sought his input on school policy decisions. Recognizing his unique perspective on student dynamics, the martial arts dojo where Marcus trained also saw changes. His uncle began offering free self-defense classes for Roosevelt High students, emphasizing the philosophical aspects of martial arts alongside the physical techniques. The program attracted students from across the social spectrum, creating an unlikely community united by their commitment to personal growth and mutual respect. As winter approached, and the cafeteria incident became part of Roosevelt High's history, rather than its daily reality, Marcus reflected on how profoundly his life had changed. The shy, invisible student who had hoped to graduate without making an impact had instead become a catalyst for positive change throughout his school community. But perhaps the most important change was within Marcus himself. He'd learned to integrate all aspects of his identity: the thoughtful philosopher, the skilled martial artist, the compassionate friend, and the natural leader. He no longer needed to choose between visibility and safety, having discovered that authentic strength attracted respect rather than aggression. Standing in the same cafeteria where his transformation had begun, Marcus watched students from different backgrounds sharing tables and conversations. The room that had once represented his isolation now symbolized the connected community he'd helped create. In the end, Derek's moment of cruelty had inadvertently given Roosevelt High something it had never had before: a shared understanding that every student's dignity mattered, and that ordinary people could accomplish extraordinary things when they chose courage over comfort. 6 months had passed since the cafeteria incident, and Marcus Chen found himself facing an entirely different set of challenges. What had begun as a simple act of self-defense had evolved into something much larger, attracting attention from beyond Roosevelt High's walls. The local news station had picked up the story after a video of Marcus's anti-bullying speech went viral on social media. Reporter Jennifer Walsh had contacted the school requesting an interview, and before Marcus knew it, he was sitting across from cameras in the school's media center, discussing his experience with a professional journalist. "Your story has resonated with young people across the country," Jennifer said during the taping. "What do you think makes your message so powerful?" Marcus considered the question carefully, still adjusting to being treated as someone whose opinions mattered on a broader scale. "I think people connect with the idea that you don't have to accept being mistreated. But they also understand that fighting back doesn't always mean using violence. Sometimes the strongest response is changing yourself and helping others do the same." The interview aired during the evening news cycle, reaching an audience far beyond Denver's suburbs. Within hours, Marcus's email inbox was flooded with messages from teenagers across the country, sharing their own experiences with bullying and asking for advice. The response was overwhelming and humbling, but the attention also brought unexpected complications. A talent scout from a major martial arts promotion company reached out, offering Marcus opportunities to compete professionally and potentially earn significant money. The prospect was tempting, especially given his family's modest financial circumstances, but it felt at odds with everything his uncle had taught him about the purpose of martial arts. "Fighting for money changes everything," David Chun explained during one of their training sessions. When you step into a ring for entertainment, martial arts becomes a business instead of a discipline. That doesn't make it wrong, but it's a different path entirely. Marcus spent weeks weighing the decision, consulting with his uncle, his parents, and even Derek, who had become an unlikely advisor on matters of character and integrity. The conversations forced him to articulate what martial arts meant to him personally, beyond its practical applications for self-defense. Meanwhile, Roosevelt High was experiencing its own growing pains as a result of the positive changes Marcus had initiated. The school district had implemented new anti-bullying protocols based on his recommendations, but change never comes without resistance. Some students and parents complained that the new policies were too restrictive, limiting normal teenage social dynamics in the name of creating a safe space. Principal Henderson called Marcus into his office one afternoon to discuss these concerns. "We've received some pushback about the new guidelines," he explained. "Some people feel we're overcorrecting, that we're trying to eliminate all conflict instead of just addressing genuine harassment." Marcus understood the dilemma. Creating a completely conflict-free environment wasn't realistic or even desirable. Teenagers needed to learn how to navigate disagreements and social tensions. The challenge was distinguishing between normal social friction and behavior that crossed the line into bullying. "Maybe the goal shouldn't be eliminating all conflict," Marcus suggested. "Maybe it should be teaching people how to handle conflict in healthy ways." This insight led to the development of a new program at Roosevelt High, mediation training, that taught students how to resolve disputes constructively. Marcus found himself at the center of this initiative, working with counselors and administrators to create a system where students could address problems before they escalated into harassment or violence. The program's first major test came when two rival groups of students got into a heated argument over gym equipment allocation. In previous years, such disputes might have festered into weeks of hostility or even physical confrontations. Instead, the involved students requested mediation sessions to work through their differences. Marcus served as one of the mediators, applying principles he'd learned from both martial arts philosophy and his own experience with conflict. The sessions required him to remain neutral while helping each side understand the other's perspective, a skill that proved more challenging than any physical technique he'd mastered. "The hardest part isn't getting people to stop fighting," Marcus observed to his uncle after one particularly difficult mediation. "It's getting them to start listening." The success of the peer mediation program attracted attention from other schools in the district. Marcus began traveling to different campuses, training other students in conflict resolution techniques, and sharing his story with new audiences. Each presentation helped him refine his message and deepen his understanding of the complex dynamics that create and sustain bullying behavior. During one such visit to Lincoln Preparatory Academy, Marcus encountered a situation that challenged everything he thought he'd learned about intervention. A student named Brian Carter approached him after his presentation, describing a pattern of harassment that sounded eerily familiar to Marcus's own experience. But when Marcus suggested that Brian speak with school administrators or seek support from friends, the younger student revealed a crucial difference. The harassment was coming from teachers, not other students. Brian's academic struggles had made him a target for sarcastic comments in public, humiliation from frustrated educators who saw him as a disruption to their classroom environments. The revelation forced Marcus to confront the limitations of his own experience and expertise. Student-to-student bullying followed certain patterns and could be addressed through peer intervention and administrative support. But harassment from authority figures required entirely different strategies and carried much higher stakes for victims who feared academic retaliation. Marcus spent the drive home thinking about Brian's situation and the responsibility he felt to help. His growing reputation as an anti-bullying advocate came with expectations that he wasn't sure he could meet. People looked to him for solutions to problems he'd never faced personally, and the weight of their trust was becoming heavier with each passing week. That evening, he called a meeting with Derek, Amanda Foster, and several other students who had become part of his informal advisory circle. They gathered in the school library after hours, using their collective experience to brainstorm approaches to Brian's dilemma. The power dynamic is completely different when the harassment comes from teachers, Amanda pointed out. Students can't exactly mediate between a kid and their chemistry instructor, but there are still options, Derek argued. Documentation, parent involvement, going up the administrative chain. The tools are different, but they exist. Marcus realized that this conversation represented exactly what he'd hoped to achieve through his advocacy work. A group of students from different backgrounds were applying critical thinking to a complex social problem, drawing on their diverse perspectives to develop solutions. The change he'd initiated at Roosevelt High had created not just a safer environment, but a more thoughtful community. As they worked through potential strategies for Brian's situation, Marcus made a decision about the professional fighting opportunity he'd been considering. The martial arts promotion company was offering substantial money and exposure, but it would require him to leave school and focus entirely on training for competition. "I'm going to turn down the fighting contract," he announced to the group. "There's more important work to do here." The decision felt right as soon as he spoke it aloud. Professional fighting might have offered financial rewards and personal recognition, but it wouldn't advance the cause that had become central to his identity. His real fight wasn't in a ring against trained opponents. It was in schools and communities where young people needed advocates and allies. Derek smiled at Marcus's announcement. "Good choice. You're too smart to just punch people for money." As the meeting concluded and his friends dispersed into the evening, Marcus reflected on how far they'd all traveled since that October afternoon in the cafeteria. The incident that had started with food and violence had blossomed into something none of them could have predicted, a movement of young people committed to treating each other with dignity and respect. Walking through Roosevelt High's empty hallways, Marcus passed the spot where Derek had first shoved him, the classroom where he'd endured weeks of harassment, and finally the cafeteria where everything had changed. Each location held memories of pain and fear, but also of growth and transformation. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Brian Carter's situation needed addressing. The peer mediation program required constant refinement, and Marcus's own college applications demanded attention. But for the first time since becoming Roosevelt High's reluctant anti-bullying advocate, Marcus felt truly prepared for whatever came next. The shy student who had once dreamed of graduating invisibly had instead become exactly what his school community needed: a bridge between different worlds, a voice for the voiceless, and living proof that ordinary people could create extraordinary change when they chose courage over comfort. 2 years later, Marcus Chun stood at the podium of the University of Colorado's Orientation Week assembly, looking out at nearly 3,000 incoming freshmen. As the recipient of the university's first ever Community Leadership Scholarship, he'd been invited to address the new students about making a positive impact on campus. The journey from Roosevelt High's cafeteria to this moment had been filled with achievements Marcus never could have imagined. His peer mediation program had been adopted by 47 schools across Colorado, and his advocacy work had earned recognition from the State Department of Education. But the statistics and accolades weren't what drove him anymore. It was the individual lives that had been changed along the way. "When I was 17, I thought strength meant being invisible," Marcus began, his voice carrying easily through the university's packed auditorium. "I believed that if I could just make it through high school without anyone noticing me, I'd be safe. But safety built on invisibility isn't really safety at all. It's just delayed vulnerability." In the audience, Marcus spotted familiar faces from his Roosevelt High days. Derek Hoffman sat in the third row, wearing his Army ROTC uniform. After graduating, Derek had enlisted in the military, crediting his transformation at Roosevelt High with giving him the discipline and self-awareness necessary for military service. They'd maintained their unlikely friendship through Derek's basic training and deployment, with Marcus serving as Derek's best man at his wedding to Sarah Mitchell just 6 months earlier. Amanda Foster occupied a seat near the center aisle, having transferred to the University of Colorado to study education policy. Her work on Roosevelt High's anti-bullying initiatives had sparked a passion for systemic educational reform, and she planned to pursue a career in school administration. The shy girl who had once organized student council meetings had become a confident advocate for comprehensive educational change. Tommy Rodriguez had taken a different path, using his athletic abilities and newfound emotional intelligence to become a youth counselor in Denver's inner-city community centers. His own experience with humiliation had given him unique insight into the struggles of young people from disadvantaged backgrounds, and his programs had gained national attention for their innovative approaches to conflict resolution. Even Kyle Morrison had found ways to channel his privilege constructively. After graduating from Roosevelt High, he'd established a foundation using his family's wealth to fund anti-bullying programs in schools across the country. His transformation from passive bystander to active philanthropist demonstrated that meaningful change could come from unexpected sources. "The incident that changed my life lasted less than a minute," Marcus continued, "but its impact has rippled outward for years. Not because of what I did in that moment, but because of what we all chose to do in the days, weeks, and months that followed." Marcus went on to describe the broader lessons he'd learned about leadership and social change. He talked about the difference between reactive and proactive advocacy, explaining how real transformation required sustained effort rather than dramatic gestures. He emphasized the importance of building coalitions across different communities and perspectives, using his own friendship with Derek as an example. "The person who humiliated me became one of my closest advisors," Marcus explained. "Not because I forgave him. Forgiveness implies he owed me something. Instead, we both recognized that we were more complex than the roles we'd been playing, and we committed to helping each other become better versions of ourselves." The audience was completely engaged now, with students leaning forward and taking notes. Marcus had learned to read crowds during his years of speaking engagements, and he could sense the moment when abstract concepts clicked into personal relevance for his listeners. "Every person in this auditorium will face situations where you have to choose between comfort and courage," Marcus said, building toward his conclusion. "You'll see someone being excluded, mistreated, or marginalized, and you'll have to decide whether to intervene or look away. Those moments don't announce themselves with fanfare. They happen quietly in cafeterias and classrooms and dormitory hallways." He shared specific strategies for bystander intervention that went beyond the simple advice to speak up. Marcus had learned that effective advocacy required preparation, allies, and understanding of institutional dynamics. He offered practical tools for building inclusive communities and addressing conflicts before they escalated into harassment. "The most important thing I want you to understand is that you don't need to be perfect to make a difference," Marcus concluded. "I wasn't a natural leader or a confident public speaker. I was just someone who got tired of accepting that cruelty was inevitable. That exhaustion with the status quo is where all meaningful change begins." As Marcus stepped away from the podium, to thunderous applause, he reflected on how far his own understanding had evolved. The teenager who had responded to bullying with defensive violence had become a young adult who understood that lasting change required building systems, relationships, and communities of support. After the presentation, Marcus was approached by Dr. Elizabeth Martinez, the university's Dean of Student Life. "We've been following your work since high school," she said. Would you be interested in helping us develop a comprehensive approach to campus climate and inclusion? The opportunity represented exactly the kind of institutional collaboration Marcus had been hoping to find in college. Rather than simply giving speeches about his high school experience, he could help create policies and programs that would prevent harassment before it started. "I'd love to be involved," Marcus replied. "But I'd like to bring other perspectives into the conversation. The best solutions come from diverse voices working together." Dr. Martinez smiled. "That's exactly why we want to work with you." Later that evening, Marcus met with his Roosevelt High friends at a local restaurant to celebrate the day's success. The conversation naturally turned to their shared experiences and how those formative events continued to shape their adult lives. Sometimes, "I wonder what would have happened if you just kept your head down that day," Derek mused over dinner. "If you'd let me get away with humiliating you, we all would have stayed exactly who we were," Amanda answered before Marcus could respond. "Marcus would have remained invisible. You would have kept bullying people, and the rest of us would have continued pretending that harassment was just part of growing up." "Instead, one moment of courage changed everything," Tommy added. "Not just for us, but for hundreds of other students who benefited from the programs we created." Marcus appreciated his friends' perspectives, but he'd come to understand that their transformation hadn't really begun with his decision to fight back. It had started with their collective choice to learn from the incident rather than simply moving past it. The violence had been a catalyst, but the real work had happened in the weeks and months of honest conversation and intentional change that followed. "The fighting was the easy part," Marcus said. "Learning to live with the consequences, building something positive from the chaos, working together despite our history. That's what actually mattered." As the evening wound down and his friends prepared to return to their respective lives and careers, Marcus felt a deep sense of satisfaction. Not because his story had a happy ending, but because it didn't really have an ending at all. The work of creating inclusive communities and standing up for human dignity was ongoing, requiring constant attention and renewed commitment. Walking across the university campus under the Colorado stars, Marcus thought about the incoming freshmen who had listened to his presentation that afternoon. Some of them would face bullying, harassment, or exclusion during their college years. Others would witness injustice and have to decide whether to intervene. A few might even become advocates and leaders themselves, carrying forward the message that ordinary people could accomplish extraordinary things. The shy teenager who had once eaten lunch alone in Roosevelt High's cafeteria was gone forever, replaced by someone who understood that true strength came not from the ability to hurt others, but from the courage to help them become their best selves. It had been a long journey from that October afternoon when Derek Hoffman dumped spaghetti on his head, but Marcus Chun had finally found his place in the world. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to make a difference, and new people who needed someone to stand with them against cruelty and indifference. But for the first time since this whole adventure began, Marcus was certain he was ready for whatever came next. The quiet kid who had once hoped to graduate invisibly had instead become exactly what the world needed: a bridge between different communities, a voice for positive change, and living proof that one person's courage could transform entire institutions. Story that began with food and violence had become something much larger, a testament to the power of choosing growth over grievance, community over isolation, and hope over cynicism. And in the end, that transformation was worth far more than any victory that could be won with elbows and fists. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.